On the 12th of June 2014, the FIFA World Cup opened in Brazil. Never in human history had more people done the same thing at the same time as football games were broadcast to people across the globe. It's hard to imagine anything more globalized and more modern. And yet the very day after the opening game, at the other end of the very same country, people who knew nothing about the World Cup, or television, or even about football, emerged from the rainforest. In a world in which there are people trying to send a rocket to Mars, and almost anyone has access in their pocket to information from every part of the globe, there is another group of people living deep in the most remote reaches of the world's greatest rainforest, who live much like they always have. In an age in which we know the chemical composition of distant planets, we don't know for sure how many there are, or even, in many cases, what languages they speak. This video tells the story of the uncontacted people of the Amazon rainforest, and why we might just have to contact them. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. In the previous videos in this series, we've looked at the mysteries of when our species came to the Amazon for the first time, and the societies they constructed when they did. We looked at the collision of these Amazonian peoples with people from another hemisphere, as Europeans and Africans turned their world upside down in a quest for domination and profit. We told the story of the rubber boom, when the Amazon was the center of the world for one of the industrial world's most precious commodities, and how the forest had defeated them all: the conquistadors, the colonists, and Henry Ford. Then, beginning in the 20th century, men at last got the upper hand, and soon began to shape the jungle to their desires, slashing, burning, and flooding it to make it a place fit for them to live. The story of the first 4 centuries of European domination of the Amazon is one of fairly consistent destruction and atrocity. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans tried their best to control the native people of the Amazon by prohibiting native languages and forcing different ethnic groups to blend with each other. Many more were forced to live in mission villages run by Catholic orders where they weren't allowed to practice their ancient ways of life. These became detribalized Indians, many of whom lost their unique cultures and oral traditions within just a couple of generations. But still, large parts of the Amazon remained unpenetrated to outsiders. Though the population of native Amazonians had crashed with the spread of unfamiliar diseases and through their exploitation and subjugation, there were still many parts of the Amazon that Europeans had never visited, either because they seemed economically unpromising or because they were too remote. And through all this time, interest in the native people's culture as having some inherent worth remained essentially zero. This started to change at the beginning of the 20th century. A pro-Indigenous movement began to grow amongst Brazilian intellectuals. Of course, it was romantic, but for the first time they began to be seen as the original Brazilians, at a time when Brazil was searching for a non-European identity. A cynic might say that only now that the indigenous peoples were a decimated minority who were no threat to the expanding nation, it became easier to pity them and wish them well. But this was an improvement. In 1910, this resulted in the establishment of the Indian Service, or SPI, as an alternative to the missionaries, who had been the only ones looking out for them. There would be no attempt at religious conversion, tribal lands would be returned to them, and indigenous societies and traditions must be respected. Tragically, and from our standpoint today, predictably, most of these 20th century contacts with isolated tribes had a similar outcome. The first encounter was usually done by skilled officers of the SPI or FUNAI, but no matter their intentions, what almost always followed was a terrible epidemic, be it of measles, influenza, or tuberculosis. Tribe after tribe was contacted, usually by government Indianists, sometimes by missionaries. Many of the tribes had decided they wanted to have contact and get access to the technology of the whites, like their metal blades. Attempts were made at inoculation or treatment, but it was hard out in the jungle. Some anthropologists predicted that by the end of the century, they would be extinct. And after this, with the tribe pacified and the SPI officers gone, when a formerly feared tribe stopped protecting their lands with violence, they would soon be invaded by settlers, loggers, ranchers, miners, or missionaries, and the SPI itself was highly imperfect. Their agents often mistreated tribes under their guardianship or collaborated with loggers and miners. A 1969 report published in the Sunday Times of London found that a majority of SPI officials were guilty of fraud, theft, or worse. It shamed Brazil. The military government dismantled the SPI, but even the worst offenders were lightly punished. The majority were brought into the department that replaced it, FUNAI. Under Brazil's military dictatorship, it was always a general who ran FUNAI, usually one that had never met an indigenous person. Encouraged by their American advisors, they were more worried about communists using the jungle as a hideout. Though nobody can be sure of exact numbers, the population of indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon shrank from several hundred thousand in 1900 to perhaps 70,000 in the 1950s. Take as a case study the Yanomami, the largest indigenous nation to survive into the 20th century still in isolation, in the borderland between Brazil and Venezuela. Disease arrived in the 50s and 60s with the gold prospectors. In 1975, the Ministry of Mines declared that the area was open to be exploited for uranium, gold, and anything else. The governor of Roraima lied about the size of the Yanomami nation, saying an area such as that cannot afford the luxury of a half-dozen Indian villages holding up development. FUNAI established a reservation for the Yanomami, but it was dismantled by one of the generals, who expelled the aid workers and missionaries. In 1984, the dictatorship decided the entire reserve could be opened to mining companies. Wildcat miners rushed there first. The Yanomami, who they found, would dig for hours, paddle anywhere, do anything for an axe or a shotgun. In 1993 came the massacre of Haximu. 16 Yanomami were killed by miners. The international media called it a genocide, and Brazil was shamed into action. The message the investigators hoped to send was that finally violence against indigenous Brazilians would not be ignored. It wasn't until the last few decades of the 20th century that things really began to improve. The 1988 constitution at the end of Brazil's military dictatorship gave the indigenous Brazilians a number of new rights, including to their land and cultural expression. Many native groups started to learn to navigate the world of Brazilian and international politics. They were beginning to fight their own political battles, and in the very language of modernity. The same roads that had spread the chaos allowed them to meet leaders of other indigenous groups. Remember, while I've used the term indigenous to describe groups that have collided with and been affected by European diseases and exploitation in a similar way, that doesn't mean they have much in common. For one thing, there are over 300 indigenous languages across the Amazon basin. Now that almost half had fewer than 500 speakers, it became imperative to bridge these divides. Groups like the Kayapó learned how to work public relations, always wearing their body paint, feather headdresses, and wooden lip discs, knowing it would guarantee them airtime. The result was legal protection for large parts of the Amazon and its indigenous inhabitants, reaching 12% of Brazil's entire area. Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador all have protected parts of the forest for their indigenous citizens as well. So, what is the state of indigenous Amazonians today? Well, it's mixed. The population of indigenous Brazilians has rebounded to around 1.1 million. Most remote groups get visited by teams doing checkups and administering treatment. Larger communities have permanent health clinics. Some groups, especially more recently, have been able to leverage ecotourism to get an income from the rainforest, or through selling cultural exhibitions to tourists, and through that preserve the integrity of their language and culture. Then there's religion.
Aqui, realmente nós estamos aqui para trazer a palavra de Deus para esse povo, por causa da palavra de Deus fala sobre amor.
For many evangelical Christians, finding and converting an actual real-life pagan is a glittering prize. There aren't many left, and the Amazon is one of the few places where it's still possible to find tribes who have never heard the words of Jesus Christ.
How do you plant a church among tribal people? How do you reach the unreachable?
We do as much as we can do until we're told to stop. We get out there on the edge and we keep trying to push.
After this tribe was contacted by the Americans, a quarter of their members died from flu and malaria.
Even still today, missionaries can be the first to reach villages. If you're a Christian, you may see no problem in this. But I can't help but feel more than anything the sense of loss when people give up their traditions to conform to a worldview that emerged thousands of miles away in the Middle East. with morals and sins that are so very different to those that have worked so well for millennia in the rainforest. To be fair though, in the worst years of Brazil's military dictatorship, it was often the missionaries who were the strongest advocates for indigenous rights, helping tribal leaders organize and enter politics. And then there is the simple pull of modernity. Many young people leave their villages for the city, and who can blame them? Who can deny them the phones and cars that we have? But cities have alcohol and drugs, just like we have. However, all of this progress was threatened with the 2018 election of Jair Bolsonaro, the son of a wildcat gold miner who campaigned on the promise not to demarcate another centimetre of indigenous land. Bolsonaro allowed landowners to claim chunks of indigenous territory that were still waiting to be demarcated. He called FUNAI, the body that protects indigenous people, a nest of rats, and brought in military officers to run it. An evangelical Christian, he nominated a former missionary to run the part of FUNAI that deals with its policy on isolated tribes. He cut the budgets of enforcement agencies and made it clear he was rooting for the land invaders. He ordered the environmental ministry to stop destroying equipment seized from illegal loggers and miners, and in 2021 visited a wildcat gold mine in indigenous territory, which are banned in the constitution, and told them he would make it legal. Incidences of abuse rose sharply under Bolsonaro. The gold miners have been back in Yanomami territory. 1,000 hectares were deforested in 1 year, maybe the highest rate since the territory was demarcated in 1992. They use mercury which enters the rivers. There are reports of miners raping Yanomami women and children and giving the men alcohol and drugs. After Bolsonaro lost to Lula in 2022, the government has made an effort at enforcement, and in February 2023 expelled some 20,000 miners from Yanomami territory. But even with Lula as president, federal lawmakers with ties to the agricultural sector are still trying to push through a bill that would roll back indigenous territories only to those areas that they were occupying in 1988, when Brazil's constitution was signed. The Supreme Court struck it down and Lula vetoed it, but these people aren't giving up, and the economic forces that they are responding to aren't going anywhere.
You earn more working illegally on indigenous land than on legally purchased land, and the lumber here is extremely high quality, so there will always be people doing this kind of work.
There's no other work here. Without a high school diploma, you can't work anywhere anymore. Where should people like me work who didn't go to high school? That's how it is here.
Vai trabalhar onde? Cuidar nisso aí, ó.
These reserve areas have to be protected. For one thing, the Yanomami and others tend to do a damn fine job of protecting the rainforest. But there is another reason why these reserve areas need to be protected, and that's because there are other groups of people out there. People we don't know much about and whom have almost ceased to exist anywhere on Earth. These reserve areas contain almost all of the isolated and uncontacted groups that still exist in Amazonia. In 2008, the world got a glimpse of something that very few people had ever seen before. Brazil's Department of Indian Affairs released a video of a group of people living deep in the Amazon rainforest. We don't know what they call themselves or how many of them there are. All we know is that they are there, living in the jungle, without knowledge of electricity in cities, social media, or fast food. They are uncontacted. We should talk about the word uncontacted here. It should be said that most, maybe all, of these groups know of the existence of the outside world and have chosen voluntary isolation. This isn't particularly surprising given the massacres, slavery, and disease that have been visited on the native peoples of the Amazon over centuries. What they know of the world outside is uncertain, but presumably warnings about white men spread to the farthest reaches of the Amazon and were passed down over generations. Also, to say that they have had no contact with modernity at all isn't completely correct, because items like machetes and metal pots have often reached them through indigenous trade networks. When one isolated group made contact, they brought with them a Corinthians wallet from a football team in Sao Paulo, a city they didn't even know existed, or could even conceive of. Nothing can be certain when it comes to the numbers of uncontacted people in the Amazon. The Brazilian government and advocacy organizations often disagree, but we're probably talking about somewhere between 70 and 100 different groups across what is called the Uncontacted frontier, which spans Brazil and Peru. The largest concentration of maybe 16 is in the Javari Valley, an area the size of Hungary. After the forceful contact of the second half of last century, FUNAI's policy is now clear. Do not initiate contact, except in the case of medical emergencies or to prevent war between tribes. Since 1987, FUNAI has only made 5 encounters with isolated tribes. They keep a distance, only making the occasional flyover to check up on them. Researchers use commercial satellite images to measure clearings, houses, and gardens, monitoring them over time. But sometimes controlled contact can be vital. Take the Javari Valley. In 2014, a group of Kurubo killed 2 men from the Matias tribe who lived 20 kilometers away in a territory dispute. The Matias had counterattacked with shotguns, killing 9 Kurubo and capturing dozens more. The Matias had been in contact since the 1970s, and in 2019 requested FUNAI make an expedition to allow peaceful contact and facilitate reunions between settled and contacted Kurubo and their family members in the isolated group. The plan was to wait for them and persuade them to stay out of the Matias territory and so reduce tensions. The Kurubo group of 34 people was successfully contacted and vaccinated for measles, flu, and other diseases. So contact, when done in the right way by the right people, can be a success. But the problem arises when the wrong people make contact. Out there in the rainforest, they live beyond the reach of national governments. Governments who lack the resources and often the political will to protect them. So this is the context in which we have one of the trickiest debates of all. Contact or no contact. Because as well-meaning as a body like FUNAI is, it's not always up to them. These people's territory is being invaded, whether we like it or not, and not by groups like FUNAI, but by illegal loggers and drug traffickers. In 2011, FUNAI had to abandon a base on the Jinani River when it was surrounded by drug traffickers. Drug traffickers, you might be surprised to learn, have no problem with shooting hostile people to secure their smuggling routes, and the Javari is on one of these routes. And they exist on a knife edge. If an isolated tribe makes contact, something as innocuous as a t-shirt can be deadly as a vector of disease. And what if an isolated group living next to a contacted group, which is often the case, steals an item that carries disease? Without immediate intervention, half the group might be dead within weeks due to having no inherited immunity to something as simple as an everyday cold. For a group of 60 people, that can be an existential blow to their reproductive viability, and in an instant, their language and culture can go essentially extinct. As Chris Feliciano Arnold writes, the survivors would be left to agonize over why the spirits had taken their loved ones, why they had been spared, where they were supposed to go now. Survivors, like the famous Man of the Hole, named after the holes he dug to trap animals, who lived alone for 25 years as the last survivor of his people killed by miners, the sole inhabitant of the Tanaru Indigenous territory in Rondônia. We didn't know his name, what language he spoke, or what his people called themselves. Just that he was the last, living in his patch of rainforest entirely surrounded by cattle ranches. And we will never know. He was found dead in his hammock, seemingly peacefully, in 2022. So it's not simply a case of waiting and seeing and letting them decide at their own pace. The answer to these questions is urgent. It might seem simple, leave them alone, but it's not. For example, Dr. Robert Walker of Missouri University lays out a couple of arguments. His team have been monitoring groups for 20 years, using satellite images to chart tribes fusing and breaking apart, and they can see them fleeing logging activity. Many of these groups have only 30 to 50 individuals. As they get smaller, their genetic pool shrinks. They also lose technological, linguistic, and cultural knowledge. 30 to 50 might be on the edge of viability. The evidence that most isolated populations are viable in the long term appears flimsy, they write. They believe they should be contacted under tightly controlled circumstances before it is too late. They want the Amazonian governments and the UN to come together and come up with a cohesive approach to protecting these groups. Well-organized contacts have the potential to save lives and decrease the risk of ethno-linguistic extinctions. They say these groups would not choose isolation if they had full information. They stay isolated because they fear extermination and slavery, which would not happen with a controlled contact. If they chose to continue their way of life, they would at least be vaccinated and know where to go for help if they needed it. They argue that not all contacts with the outside world are devastating. Modern medicine greatly reduces the risk. In contrast, the loggers don't bring vaccination teams with them.
Their words have now been fully translated, and they reveal the group were fleeing something terrible.
Fundamentally, they say, contact is already happening, which is hard to dispute. Further contact is inevitable. On the other side of the debate are Survival International and similar organizations who are hoping that these groups can survive the uncontrolled contacts with drug smugglers, gold prospectors, and illegal loggers, or that these contacts can be stopped. From Survival International's perspective, initiating contact plays into the hands of those who want further development in the Amazon. According to their president, there are plenty of contacted tribes who do know what happens and respond by striving to protect isolated relatives from contact. And they totally dispute the claim that these groups are on the edge of viability as long as their lands are protected. As Fiona Watson of Survival International writes of people who want controlled contacts, they are playing God. It's very paternalistic, saying we will contact the natives because we know what's best for them and they need the benefits of our wonderful society. They are doing the dirty work of governments and multinational corporations that want nothing more than for these tribes to be contacted and out of the way so they can go about their business. Nobody can really know what these people think or want. We're saying they have the right to decide whether they want to make contact or not. It's not up to survival or anthropologists or Funai to make that decision. These people have survived the most tumultuous century, and they are still here. The onus is on all of us to make the state protect these areas. We should remember that both sides of this debate, which is very heated, want the same thing: to prevent the extinction of these isolated groups. After these people have been contacted though, isn't something then gone forever? Once contacted, there might be no going back. But are we supposed to keep humans living in a zoo? And if we do give them vaccinations and antibiotics, what other wonders of the modern world should we show them? Clearly the answer is that the governments of the countries in which these people live should be doing more, a lot more, to protect them. But the fact is they aren't protecting them, or can't protect them. And if we can't change that fact, what should we do? It is in response to this that Funai released the footage that we opened this video with. These people are under threat by illegal loggers and miners, who are the modern-day inheritors of the conquistadors and the rubber barons. What price will be paid if they are left to fend for themselves against smugglers wielding weapons of modern war? Does respecting their self-determination mean leaving them alone, or does it mean showing them the modern world and letting them choose their future?
Roupa shira, paneira, roupa, sapa, iscara shira, roupa, sal shira, iscara shira, né? Aí por isso que diz que não vai querer mais nu, não, diz que vai querer como nós tá bem, com roupa, tantas coisas, o panela, prato para comer. Iscara shira, né? Não, ele quer aprender assim. Iscara shira.
Lá tu ia já sal, lá tu já no lá. No lá aí tá. Pau se a tipo. Ali. Ali ao se. Tu as pui. Ali. Tá. Limitou as carteiras, da do limitar, mas tem que escalar as caixas no muito, muito acho.
Por que os índios têm que estar dentro de uma redoma de vidro, todo a tempo com pena, nu, cantando e dançando? Claro que eles vão conhecer o mundo e vão mudar. É perigoso? É. Dá problema? Dá. Vai morrer índio? Vai. Vai ficar índio pirado? Vai. Mas isso é assim que é, meu amigo. Assim é que é a vida. Quem não se modifica na natureza, quem não se adapta, morre. É Darwin.
To finish the series, my friend Dan and I still had to make our way down the last part of the world's biggest river, from Santarém to Macapá, on a riverboat, appropriately enough, called Amazonas. The boat's departure was delayed for a couple of hours, which would have been annoying, but it was hard to be annoyed about anything when all we had to do was watch the river dolphins surface in the warm rainforest evening. Every riverboat is a little different. They differentiate by size, amenities, and how much of a party they are. Our party status was moderate. It's dark by the time we eventually set sail, and everyone fairly quickly goes to bed to wake up in the morning in a new world. I don't know what this fellow was doing. Presumably he was fixing something. We turned off the main river to take a shortcut down one of the many side channels of the Amazon. Compared to our journey from Manaus to Santarém, this trip down the river was more intimate. Closer to the shore, we could really see the little farms where so many people live, spread throughout this continent-sized forest. You can see how life here is dominated by the rise and fall of the water, by the fact that everything is built on stilts. The boats are not just transporting people, but are themselves floating warehouses, and are the main way that people living along the river buy their necessities. There are the ports that we stop at, of course, but when just a person or two wants to get on, this is how they do it. The settlements on this side channel are really pretty diffuse, though they also come with the amenities of any small town, like a church and a post office. From the riverboat, it's quite clear to see just how basic are the living conditions of many people throughout the Amazon. However, while that might be true, these people are still consumers, and as Brazil has grown economically, a network of companies have sprung up to cater to them, with these boats being key parts of the system. It's amazing what you can get delivered in the rainforest. Compared to centuries past, this must make life in the Amazon a lot easier. These guys seem to be buying chicken feed. The stage for most social life on the riverboats is the top level, and two of the most recent arrivals are attracting some attention. couldn't hear what they were talking about, but I know rejection when I see it. Some people have got better things to do. This is the eating area, with free coffee and set times for the meals, which, as fixed points in the otherwise formless expanse of the day, everyone looks forward to. Almaring is one of the larger towns of the lower Amazon between Santarém and the coast. Each stop seems a little different, and the noticeable thing about Almaring are the cheese sellers. We were also visited by police. Whether they were checking for drugs or illegal migrants, I do not know. What they found was probably mainly cheese. Though large for an Amazonian town, Almaring is really quite small, especially compared to the immensity of the river. Even on the main river, you're far from just about anywhere, and growing up here, you have to take an impressive amount of responsibility. To these kids, pulling up to a riverboat to make a purchase or drop something off seemed to come as second nature, with the exhaust simply one of the workaday hazards of jungle life. It doesn't matter if you're a visitor, fresh to the jungle like us, or a local. With ever-changing scenery, it never gets old to sit back and watch the river go by. We arrive at Macapá, the capital of the state of Amapá, early in the morning, but stay sleeping on board until daybreak. Macapá is a city of about 500,000 people. The equator runs through it, which I visited very briefly. Hey. It is also one of the most violent cities in Brazil, and, apart from the equator, doesn't have a ton to do or see. Though we did walk around the old fort and the harbour. The centre, otherwise, is unremarkable. Because of the Amazon River standing in the way, the only road that leads anywhere from Macapá heads northwest, and that is why we were there. It took a few hours of waiting while our taxi driver lied to us about having other passengers, but we finally got on the road. It was exciting because we were going to another country. We were going to France. Oiapoque sits on the border between Brazil and French Guiana, and that, really, is its reason for existence. Boats zip back and forth carrying passengers, each crossing of the river a journey between South America and Europe. So that has been the story of the Amazon. Each year we know more about the natural world of the Amazon and the world that existed before Europeans arrived. We've looked at the changes that were the result of those arrivals, and we've looked at what the Amazon is like today. Now we're going to get on a boat, we're going to cross this river, and we're going to explore French Guiana. The following 2 videos in the series tell the story of French Guiana.